Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar on teaching personality psychology with Dr. Robert Bornstein. We will get started momentarily. Thank you so much for joining us. As you're joining, please tell us where you're joining from. We'd love to see where everyone is currently at geographically. And again, welcome everyone. We'll get started momentarily, just giving everyone a chance to log in. Share with us in the chat where you're here from. Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Austin, Atlanta, California, Germany. Welcome. Welcome to our international friends. Love to
Donna.
see it. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started momentarily. Everyone is letting us know in the chat where they're joining from. We're glad to have you here with us today on our webinar on teaching personality. All right. So I'm going to go ahead. We have one poll that I would love to know what everyone's experience is teaching personality. So do you teach it regularly, occasionally, as part of a larger course, or you haven't taught it, but you will in the future? I know these answers don't cover everyone's situation, but hopefully it applies to most people here today. Great. Gosh, y'all are so responsive. Really appreciate it. And again, welcome to everyone who's just joining us. We're so happy to have you here with us today to talk about teaching personality. I am going to stop the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, Dr. Bornstein. So we have it's all across the board. So 24% of people that teach regularly, 17% who teach occasionally, 32 that teach it as part of a larger course, and 28% who might be teaching it in the future. So welcome to you all. We're so glad to have you here today. More people telling us where they're joining from in the chat. Nigeria, wow. Thank you for joining us. To all of our international attendees, we appreciate you as well as everyone here in the US and Canada. So I just want to take care of a few housekeeping items first. Everyone is muted to prevent accidental background noise, and we have enabled captions for those that need them. Our chat is open. Please, please, please feel free to use it to talk to your fellow attendees. We love that. But Q&A is also open. So please use Q&A to ask questions directly of myself or Dr. Bornstein. My name is Andrea Bergoa. I am the Higher Ed Marketing Manager here at APA. I'm very sorry I failed to introduce myself at the beginning. But yes, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions of us, and then use chat to talk to your fellow attendees. We are recording this. It will be shared afterwards, and those who attend today will also be receiving attendance certificates. Now that I've got all of that boring stuff out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Bornstein. He is a professor at the Gordon F. Derner School of Psychology at Adelphi University. He's an established researcher with national and international visibility, and he has published more than 200 articles in peer-reviewed journals, along with about 60 book chapters, and written or edited more than a dozen books. Dr. Bornstein has received 5 federal grants from the National Institute of Mental Health and National Science Foundation. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, Association for Psychological Science, and Society for Personality Assessment, and served as the former president of SPA. Dr. Bornstein received the Society for Personality Assessments in 1995, 99, 2002, 2012, and 2018 awards for distinguished contributions to personality assessment literature. He also received the 2016 American Psychological Association Division 12, Section 9 Distinguished Distinguished Contribution Award, that was a mouthful, and the American Psychological Foundation's 2005 Theodore Malone Award for Excellence in Personality Research. So welcome, Dr. Bornstein. We are so pleased to have you here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Again, please use the chat to talk amongst yourselves. Use Q&A to communicate directly with Dr. Bornstein and myself. And we'll have time for questions intermittently throughout the presentation.
Well, thank you so much for that great introduction. I really appreciate, and I appreciate, Andrea, all of your help in getting this webinar together. Couldn't have done it without you, that's for sure. So let me share my screen. That'll take a sec here. And talk a little bit about while we're here. I first taught undergraduate personality in September 1986. It was in fact the first class that I taught in my first permanent job was a theories of personality class. So I've taught it for several, getting on 40 years. And what I found is that this is a course that has a profound impact on students, not only with respect to their understanding of psychology and personality, but with respect to their understanding of themselves. But it really only has a profound impact on students if we teach it right. So what I'd like to talk about today is really a better strategy, I think, for thinking about undergraduate personality classes. I'm grateful to APA Books for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And so let me go back to my story. I've always loved teaching the personality course. But one of the things that I recognized pretty early on in this effort was that the personality books that were available were not allowing me to do as good a job as I had hoped. The main problem, or at least one of the main problems, the one that revealed itself to me first was there's too much material in the book. And personality texts at that time, and it's still true today, typically have maybe between 12 and 18 chapters, often defined by different theorists. So they'll have a chapter on Alfred Adler's work, and they'll have a chapter on George Kelly's personal constructs model, and so on and so on. A student who was in one of my first personality classes back at Gettysburg College when I was just starting out, who did very well in the course, and in fact ended up being my research assistant and collaborator, and eventually went on to get her PhD in psychology. Student said to me in a private conversation after the course was done, she says, I really enjoyed the theories of personality course. But about midway through the semester, it started to seem like we were doing a kind of a theory of the week model. And I ended up walking away, she says, from the course, feeling as though there are a lot of different perspectives on personality. And we don't really know which one's best, which one's most useful. Well, that stuck with me. And I realized that we need to cover fewer theorists and leave ourselves room to talk more deeply about those that we do cover. So now, or I should say, looking forward, it's 30 odd years later, and I'm thinking, I've tried all kinds of different ways to teach the class over those years. And I said, maybe someone needs to write a book that formalizes a new, better way of teaching undergraduate personality, and maybe that person needs to be me. So I brought that idea to APA. I brought it to other publishers as well. APA was the only publisher that didn't try to change my vision to something more traditional, and I'm very grateful for that. And thank you all too. I'm very grateful that you took the time to come here. I know how busy things get. And at least in our neck of the woods at Adelphi, it's the first week of classes, so this is a very busy time. And thank you for coming. But let me go ahead and present what I think of as something really different as an approach to this course. And here's where we're going. I think this is true of every course you teach, and I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to this. But before we do anything else, we need to think about what are we trying to accomplish in our undergraduate personality class? Because really every decision that you make comes back to, is that moving me closer to what I'm trying to accomplish? Or is it not? With that in mind, we can talk about why, at least in my view, the traditional approach to teaching personality doesn't work, and that maybe there's a way to do it better. At that point, I'd like to present to you the main concepts that underlie my different approach. So if that all sounds okay, let's get started. What are we trying to accomplish when we teach undergraduate personality? Well, I would say at least three things. We want our students to understand the major theoretical perspectives. I know, of course, that there's variability among instructors in what they see as the most important perspectives, but I think we can all agree broadly on the major perspectives that even if you as an instructor aren't in love with, students do need to hear about. Second thing we're trying to do is to help our students understand personality research, how it's conducted, how it differs from research in other areas of psychology, and also findings, both classic and contemporary. I guess I'm a bit of a traditionalist in that regard. I really do believe that it's important for our students to hear about classic studies in personality, as well as what's going on in 2023 and 2024. And my other objective is to make personality relevant to students with different life experiences. Now, one way to do that, I found, is to talk early on in the course about Hofstede's dimensions of culture. Students, it turns out, are pretty familiar with that first dimension of individualism and collectivism. But students are not very familiar with the other 5 dimensions. So one thing that we do in class sometimes, depends a little bit on the nature of the class, the group of students in the class. So one thing that we do early on in the semester is think about and talk about these different dimensions of culture, not so much the first, but the other 5, because students don't have a fixed idea of where, for example, US culture falls on that dimension of power distance or uncertainty avoidance. And maybe you and I don't either. We think a lot less, most of us, about these. But it's a good way to get a discussion going. And it's a good icebreaker for students. It also puts culture front and center in the course, which I think is an important thing to do. I do want to say that when we talk about reaching students with different life experiences, I'm not only talking about people from different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. If you have taught personality before, and it looked like, in fact, half, at least, of our group has taught personality, at least occasionally. If you've taught personality before, you know that this is a very diverse set of students in the classroom. And what I mean by that is, at least in our institution, about half of the class is made up of psychology majors. The other class is students from all sorts of areas, biology students, English majors. We get students at Adelphi in this class from social work, nursing, business and management. And so when I say making the material relevant for students with different experiences, I want this course to be useful to biology majors and management majors too, not just psychology majors. So that's the jumping off point for how I think about organizing this class. And my experience, probably somewhat like yours, in that I started out using the books that everybody else used. When I took undergraduate personality, and this was September 1978, when I took undergraduate personality, we used, and those of you who've been around for a while are going to recognize this, we used the old Hall and Lindsey text, the classic text. I think maybe it was like the only text because it seemed like everybody used Hall and Lindsey when I was taking undergraduate personality. So what did I use when I taught my first personality class in 1986? Well, I used Hall and Lindsey. Okay. And it worked well enough. And as large, comprehensive, heavy personality books goes, good one. But as I moved through the years and worked with that and with other texts, I realized there are structural obstacles here that are getting in our way. And until we can get those obstacles out of the way, we're really never going to be able to optimize this class and make it as good an experience as we can for the students. And so you can see, I think in some sense, the most important limitation of the traditional big old heavy personality textbook approach to this, too many theories. Now, okay, so I took personality quite a while ago. Before I stood up in front of a large number of people and said what I just said, I thought, I better check and see if this is still true. And so I did, and did a somewhat systematic search of the personality texts that are out there today and the most popular texts that are out there today. And by and large, most personality texts, most undergraduate personality texts have somewhere between 10 and 18 different theories, present between 10 and 18 different theories. Hall and Lindsey, by the way, I went back and looked, had 13. And okay, problem is, doesn't allow you to dig in. And some of these theories are interesting, but they're not really used in mainstream psychology anymore. My textbook had a chapter devoted to the work of Jung. It had a chapter devoted to the work of George Kelly. Those of you who are familiar with George Kelly may remember he's the personal constructs person. And I should love George Kelly. He was my dissertation advisor's dissertation advisor. He's my intellectual grandpa. But I don't know that students need to hear or read an entire chapter on George Kelly's work in 2024. Second challenge I find in the traditional approach is that the theories, however many there may be, are not contextualized properly. We talk, for example, about cognitive behavioral approaches to personality without making the connection between those approaches and basic concepts and findings from cognitive psychology. We teach cognitive behavioral approaches to personality as if they were uninformed by this other area of research. We teach object relations theory without connecting it back to Developmental psychology. That's what I mean by insufficient context. We need to contextualize our presentations more effectively in the personality course. And then the third limitation, which I realize probably seems like it overlaps with the second, I'm calling poor integration of theory and research. What I mean by that is for one thing, most personality texts don't give, I think, sufficient time to talking about important research findings. Beyond that, when research is discussed in most personality texts, the research that gets mentioned is research that is supportive of a particular theory. We don't talk very much about research that didn't support a theory and compelled psychologists to update, revise, and rework that theory. So in my course and in my writing, I've tried in particular to bring in work that changed different theories of personality, not only research that supported hypotheses from specific theories of personality. The nice thing about that is students get to experience just a little bit the process of science.
All right, Bob, we've got a few questions. We've also got some great discussion in the chat. I did just want to say that there was a lot of emphasis in the chat on application of theory. Sometimes theory is overwhelming without application. Someone mentioned that it bothered them. They got very little personality education with 2 child and adolescent development degrees. So that's what's happening in the chat right now. As far as questions and Q&A, we did get a question on the chart that you shared earlier, long-term versus short-term orientation. Seems counterintuitive. It seems like the descriptions should be reversed. I don't know if you wanted to go back to that slide.
I may need to, sorry that I'm going in reverse here, everybody. I may need to do that. Long-term versus short. The degree to which long-standing traditions are valued and maintained versus an emphasis on innovation and adaptation. You may be right. You know, honestly, I'm not expert enough in Hofstede's work to, and you're right. It does look like those terms may be reversed. And you probably know who I'm talking to, whoever asked the question. Probably know more about this area than I do, so you're probably right, but I'll certainly check on that if that is true. And I'll certainly check on that to see if that's true, and I can respond to that better, I think.
And we did have a question on integrating updated neuroscience or biopsychological data regarding brain and behavior. Do you include that in your curriculum?
I do. Thank you. That is a very good question. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but because I'll say a little bit more about how we do integrate neuroscience and other biological perspectives into the course. But I will say now, in the short answer to your question, is that in each of the main chapters of the book, and the way that this book is set up, there's an opening chapter that's called What is Personality, where we deal with some basic issues, deal with defining personality and culture, personality research methods, and some other things. And there's a closing chapter, The Future of Personality. In the main chapters, and there are 4 of them, because I deal with 4 meta perspectives. Within each of those chapters, we include 4 boxes, sidebars, linking that particular perspective to research in 1, cognitive psychology, 2, social psychology, 3, developmental psychology, and 4, neuroscience, every chapter. So there's that. And then within the narrative portion of the chapter, as best I can, and of course it varies from topic to topic, we'll try to bring in each of those perspectives as well within the narrative of the book, as in addition to the sidebars boxes.
Bob, there was also a question about extending what you're saying to the importance of psychotherapy integration.
In terms of an application, you mean?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. The same thing is true, well, not exactly the same thing, but in each chapter, not in a sidebar, I try to address how that perspective is operationalized, I guess, as a treatment method. And so we have sections on treatment approaches derived from the psychodynamic perspective, from behavioral and cognitive behavioral models, from trait and interpersonal frameworks, and from humanistic and existential models as well. So that's a great application, and of course for the students who take that course, very interested in that material.
Okay, I think I'm going to do one more question and then we can move on because I am mindful of our time that we have here. Any questions that are not answered in this session today, and even some that are, I will send to Dr. Bornstein afterwards, and we will get written responses. So can you speak to how to incorporate international or non-Western concepts into the conversation of personality theory?
We certainly try to talk about cultural concepts in as nuanced a way as we can. So, and in every chapter as well. But I have to admit, you know, I'll speak only for myself. I work hard to bring culturally relevant material into all of my classes. I think I do a pretty good job of doing that. But like many of us, I probably don't do as good a job as I could do, and continue to work at it, try to get better every year. So, my answer is, I, I guess, I think we address cultural issues as well as anyone does in this context. Am I satisfied? I am not. I want to do better. So, let's go ahead to the third issue to be taken up. And the question, which, I guess this must be a kind of a rhetorical question here. Can we teach this course more effectively? Because if the answer was no, well, we wouldn't be here. So the answer is yes, but that's not a great answer. I guess the question really is more, how can we teach this course more effectively? 4 things. As you have heard, as I began talking about my own kind of experience and evolution as a teacher of personality, and I guess I didn't say it exactly that way. Much of my early career was spent trimming from this course theoretical perspectives that just didn't seem to be really salient to students' experience. But even now and moving forward, I think that to teach undergraduate personality as effectively as we can, we need to move from the old theorist-driven model, where different chapters are named after different people, to a perspective-driven model. We need to be organizing our courses around theories, not theorists. Secondly, we need some kind of an organizing concept, a focus, a unifying theme that is going to connect the different parts of the course and tie everything together. For me, this theme turns out to be discovering connections. More on that in a moment. Third, and I guess I need to provide a little background for this. In all of my classes, I think it's important to create a safe environment for students, an environment where people feel comfortable asking questions, an environment where people feel comfortable challenging the professor or challenging what they're reading in the book, challenging the assumptions underlying a different theory or the implications of that theory. So the safe environment is key. But within the context of a classroom that feels safe to the students, I also think there are times when it's important to make people a little bit uncomfortable. And I'm following the guidance of someone I admire very much here in what I just said, is I think sometimes, even though mostly you want your students to be comfortable, sometimes you want to make a little trouble in your class. And I think you want to bring up issues and ask them questions that make them a little bit uncomfortable. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. When I first began teaching this class, I included discussion of Maslow's concept of the peak experience. There was very little research on the peak experience back in, say, the early 1990s. Very little research on the peak experience. There's a surprising amount of research on peak experiences now, which is enormously helpful in teaching this class. But one of these things that researchers have found is that when you ask people to, young people, to describe the kinds of situations and contexts in which they have had what seemed to them to be something like a peak experience, well, you get a range of things, including the expectable ones, like being in nature is a common setting, or engaging a great work of art or music, and you get those. But evidence suggests that some of the other contexts include things like being in a religious setting and deeply involved in prayer. Evidence suggests that people report peak experiences under the influence of recreational drugs. Evidence suggests this, especially psilocybin. And my question to the students may be, those situations, such as, for example, when a person is under the influence of hallucinogen, is that a real peak experience? I don't have an answer to that, but I love to hear what the students have to say about it. And trust me, when you ask that question, they have opinions. And that's what I mean by challenging issues, that kind of thing. And last, I say here, be a role model, teach outside the box. One way that a person can be a role model for their students, in my view, now I know this isn't for everybody, but this is me. One way to be a role model, in my view, is to try to find personal experiences, the professor's personal experiences, and anecdotes, personal anecdotes that can help illustrate key points in a really useful way. And can we do that in a personality class? Well, I'll tell you a story. During my sophomore year of college, I came back to campus on the Sunday after Thanksgiving break. It turns out the college that I went to gave students the entire week off for Thanksgiving. They didn't hold classes on Monday and Tuesday, which is great. Adelphi should do that, but they don't. Um, so I got back on Sunday. The dining hall didn't open until Monday. So I ordered pizza from the pizza place that everybody ordered from. It was a great pizza place. It was right near campus, and essentially 90% of their business came from campus. So I ordered my pizza, ate my pizza. I love my pizza. A couple hours later, I was a little more ambivalent about the pizza. Something was wrong. I had gotten food poisoning. It took me a while to figure it out, but I finally concluded, at any rate, this is what I think happened, was that students had been away for 10 days. They hadn't sold a whole lot of pizzas in 10 days, and some of the stuff had gone bad. And me, who came back early from break, I got some of that stuff. And so I got sick as a dog. And it took me 6 months to eat pizza again, which those of you who know me, and I know there are a few of you there, well, doesn't sound like Bob, but it's true. And you would say, wow, that's a lot of information that I didn't really need to hear. But it's a nice way to introduce students to the concept of taste aversion learning. And it also allowed me to talk about stimulus generalization, because it turns out, even though I got sick on a plain old cheese pizza, I couldn't touch pizzas with pepperoni or mushrooms on them either. My aversion generalized a little bit. Couldn't touch pizzas from other pizza places either. Generalization. And discrimination too. Yeah, my fear of things that were pizza-like generalized somewhat, but I could still eat calzone. I could still eat chicken parm. So it's nice. I think that's one way to be a real role model for your students, is to shared experiences. And the second, teach outside the box. I think this is an unusual thing, but Kahneman's work and this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, plays an important role in my theories of personality class. Because what it tells us is that we humans are not really wired to process information as accurately as possible. What we are is wired to process things and perceive things and judge things as accurately as we can, while still being efficient in doing so. We want to be as accurate as we can be in our judgments, while still preserving as much mental energy as we can for other tasks, should they come along. And the nice thing about that, from the perspective of what we're trying to achieve in our course, is, and I tell the students, that's certainly true of you all, and it's as true of me now as it ever was, and it always will be. Experience does not protect you from these information processing limitations, so it humanizes us and it connects us. That's why I think that sort of, quote, teaching outside the box is so important. And all of which is what led me to try to organize a book that overcame some of the limitations in what was out there, and that became Personality Discovering Connections. And there you see the overarching theme of my book. So let me talk a little bit about how this book, I think, enables us to do a better job. And listen, I'm really more interested in the principles that will allow us all to do a better job than pitching books. So that's the important thing. First, the approach that I've taken allows us to go beyond what my student warned me about 30-ish years ago. It enables us to go beyond the old theory of the week model. So I had mentioned earlier on in our webinar the organization of the book and 6 chapters in the opening and closing. And here are the 4 middle chapters, and they're long, and they're comprehensive. As comprehensive as they should be for an undergraduate class. The psychodynamic perspective, behavioral and cognitive behavioral. My chapter on trait theory is a little bit different than what's in most books these days because, in my view, a lot of the really exciting work that's going on in trait theory now has to do not necessarily with something like the 5-factor model. There's a lot of great research, a lot of great work going on on the 5-factor model. But a lot of the exciting research in trait theory has to do with interpersonal theory, the interpersonal circumplex, and some of the ideas and findings that have emerged from that. So that's central in this chapter, in this portion of the book. And then finally, the humanistic and existential approaches. So beyond theory of the week. Second, I've tried to write a book that's both student-focused and teacher-friendly. Student-focused in that by jettisoning some of the extraneous material, we're able to talk about the major concepts and findings in greater detail without overwhelming students with a lot of kind of ancillary subsidiary material. It allows for a shorter text and a text that's less expensive than what's out there. And the other thing that's useful from a student's perspective, I think, is to include good supporting ancillary materials like suggested readings and practice quizzes and those sorts of things. And for me, one of the really important materials for students are critical thinking and discussion questions. So this is just a couple of examples. They're in every chapter. This is just a couple of examples, and as you'll be able to see, and I'm gonna read them to you. The first question is designed to help students think more deeply about concepts and findings. So, modern trait theory can be traced to Allport and Ogbert's 1936 study, wherein they extracted from a dictionary every word that described a personality trait. Do you think that this lexical approach is a good strategy for discovering which trait terms are most useful in capturing the complexity of human behavior? If you were trying to accomplish this goal today, what strategy would you use to identify the most useful contemporary personality trait terms? And I think students are going to drift towards social media here. We'll find out. Anyway, that's a content-focused critical thinking question. Other critical thinking questions are really designed to help students self-reflect. So I'll read you the second. The 5-factor model contends that personality can be described in terms of 5 broad factors or trait domains: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Where do you think you'd fall on these 5 dimensions? What would your FFM profile look like? And so that's more self-reflection. So it's helping to accomplish 2 of our goals, 2 of our major goals. It's a teacher-friendly book as well, in the sense of when I was using, the old 15-chapter personality book, I found myself, look, let me say it differently. You can't ask students to spend $100+ on a book, which was what the comprehensive personality texts cost, even back then. You can't ask students to spend $100 on a book and then not cover the majority of material in the book. You can't do it. So I found myself teaching chapters. I knew were not that important, just so that we covered 2/3 of the book and students didn't come back yelling at me at the end of the semester. When you deal with meta perspectives instead of theorist-driven chapters, that problem is gone. And not only that, you, the instructor, have a lot of flexibility to customize this course in a way that works for you. And so part of the ancillary materials that are posted on the website, and I'm happy because I know this is a bit small, and I'm happy to send this to you after the webinar is done, is a model syllabus. Now, this is a 15-week, model syllabus that I developed. Obviously, it can be for a longer or shorter period of time. Let me show you a little bit more readable version of this model syllabus. And what I've done, essentially here, I'm showing you the first half, the first half of the semester, and how it would work in my approach, in my model. And you can see we're moving through the chapters. They're in order and spending a week on the opening chapter, what is personality? And then I'm leaving here 3 weeks from the psychodynamic perspective, 3 for the cognitive behavioral, and then 3 and 3 for the other 2. You can lengthen any of those, 3-week periods for a perspective that you find more useful. You can shorten any of those 3-week periods for a perspective that you find less useful. So there's some flexibility in there for anyone who's teaching the course. And the other thing you see if you look over to the right-hand column is one of the nice things about a somewhat briefer text is you can supplement it with primary sources. And I do that. And whether or not you ever use this book or look at it in your life, I really encourage you to add into your course primary sources. And the way I like to do it is for each perspective to include at least one classic source and one contemporary source. You can do more than that, but I think it's helpful for students to hear the voice of the person who, of a person who played a key role in developing that theory. So you can see there in that psychodynamic section, we include Freud's essay, Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices. And there's a challenging issue for you too. Students have some opinions about that one. And you can see that this section ends here with Kernberg's 2021 article on the future of psychoanalysis. And then you can see down below a somewhat similar model for our cognitive behavioral perspective. How do you not open with psychology as the behaviorist views it, right? But it's nice also to end with a recent writing by Bandura. So lots of flexibility to supplement on behalf of the students. And the third advantage, I think, of this approach is it allows me, it might allow you, it allows the instructor, I guess that's what I'm trying to say, to use this theme of discovering connections to pull everything together and organize the text. And we do that in more than one way. Now I know because of someone asked a really good question before, so sorry that I went out of order. In each chapter, we do connect that perspective, that paradigm, with research in each area of psychology, developmental, social, cognitive, neuroscience. This is a table from chapter 1 where kind of lay the groundwork for what's going to happen later in the books to, as you can see, talk a little bit about how personality connects with other areas of psychology. And here it's a little bit tricky now to give examples, but I think I figured out a way I can do it. Because if we have 4 major perspectives, which we do, and I'm trying to connect each perspective to 4 subfields, you see. So there are actually, across the book here, 16 boxes four in each chapter, connecting, that work to a different area of psychology. Well, you don't need to hear me talk about 16 different boxes. But maybe we can look at some examples of how they are. When we're talking about pre-conscious processing in the context of the psychodynamic perspective, cognitive research, the cocktail party effect, turns out to be hugely helpful in making that real for students. By the way, I'm always afraid that some of these old terms I'm gonna put out there and students are gonna give me that look of like, what are you talking about? So here's good news, because I just did it too, a month ago. Yes, students actually still do know what cocktail parties are. They do. 19-year-olds looked at me like, yeah, I get that. They could tell from my expression. I was like, I don't know if you guys are understanding what I'm doing. In our behavioral and cognitive behavioral chapter, we talk about conditioned immune responses. Yep, you can condition the immune system. In our trait interpersonal chapter, we connect with social psychology here, talking about the influence of traits on friendship dynamics, friendship formation, friendship maintenance. Social psychologists have done a lot of work in that area. And in our humanistic existential chapter, we have an opportunity to connect to developmental psychology as we talk about the construction of the self as humanistic personality theorists talk about it. So those are just examples. The other important, or another important kind of connections are connections beyond psychology. This actually goes back a little bit to the issue of theory and application. Some of these involve application as well. But within each chapter, I connect that perspective to at least one other area. I mean, something completely outside psychology. So we discuss how recent research in anthropology has helped theorists and researchers revise their understanding of the Oedipal dynamic. When we talk about covert conditioning in the context of Skinner's work, we're able to link that back to philosophy and free will and ethics. Is it really all right to reshape the environment to modify people's behavior without telling them that you're doing so? Good question. We link trait theory to genetics and evolutionary theory, and humanistic personality theory to business and management. But those are just examples. I mean, there are a lot of untapped opportunities for connections beyond psychology here. The thing is, for all of that, and those are the two important connections that are formalized in the book. The other connection that's important, it's subtler, but it's there, and it is part of the glue that holds everything together, is the connection between students and professors. And that's why saying a few things about our shared experiences, me and my students, I think is helpful. That's why using personal anecdotes, like my pizza experience, or, for example, how my relationship with my grandfather is informed by object relations theory and the process of internalizing mental images of important people in your life. Those kinds of personal connections. In some ways, those might be the most important connections at all. So, Andrew, I see that it's getting to be a little tight, but maybe there's another question or two that people had. I don't know.
Yeah. So Bob, you're gonna have to go back and read the chat transcript because it's hopping in here.
Oh yeah. Are they
Lots of
mad?
discussion of Freud. Loving that discussion. There were quite a few questions on research methods and whether you cover research methods and how there was a question that mentioned machine learning. Is there coverage of research methods and contemporary technology used in personality research, such as machine learning?
What was the last part of it? I got all the first part of it.
Yeah. Is there coverage of research methods and contemporary technology used in personality research, excuse me, such as machine learning?
That's a great question.
Mhm.
I don't include machine learning, and I probably should have. See, whoever asked that, you need to be co-author on the book. We certainly talk about the impact of technology on personality research. And I talk actually about some of the platforms like MTurk and Prolific and how that's changed things. And I also, and I realize this will sound like the loosest association in history, talk about the impact of the Xerox machine on how students approach all of their courses. That's a long story. That's probably a story for another time. It's true. I think the Xerox machine it has changed the nature of scholarship and the nature of undergraduate scholarship. Um, but machine learning, that's a great idea.
And there were quite a few questions about um, Myers-Briggs and the Big Five. What is your view of the Big Five versus MBTI view of personality? Do you think they really are as different as they are made out to be?
Uh, well, they're different in that well, they have different. I want to say sort of birthplaces. They have different origins. That's what I mean. And so that each of them is driven in part by a set of assumptions that doesn't apply exactly to the other one. Five-factor model emerged really out of Allport's and Cattell's work and others, and Goldberg later and others. Um, Whereas the Myers-Briggs emerged out of Jung's work. And so in that sense, they are quite different. And I mean, so how would you handle that in a personality class? If you want to talk about the ways that they're similar, you can. Your job at that point will be to focus on how both of those measures conceptualize our behavioral predispositions in a trait-like manner. There are different traits in the five-factor model and the Myers-Briggs, but they do see them as being stable over time, basically stable across situation, and so on and so on and so on. So that's one way to address that question. If in the context of the way you're teaching the class, it's more helpful in this moment to talk about how those two ostensibly similar measures are actually really different. Well, then you can talk about some of the content issues, some of the underlying assumptions, and some of the ways that the two measures have evolved over time that accentuate their differences. I hope that made sense. I hope that was a good answer to that.
It was great. We are running up on 2 o'clock Eastern, and I just want to thank everyone for attending, participating in the conversation, asking such great questions. There are way too many questions for us to get with today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send them all of your great questions to Bob, and he will answer them, and we will send them out as a supplementary resource along with everything else we're sending. So we'll send you the recording, we'll send you a copy of the slides. But thank you to everyone for joining us today. I put a link in the chat. I'll do it again. If you would like to request an exam copy of Elements of Personality, you can do so at that link. Check out the table of contents, additional resources. But thank you to you all for joining us today and having such a great conversation. And thank you to Dr. Bornstein for all of your wonderful insights in writing this great, brief, and engaging text. And yeah, thank you so much. We've reached 2 o'clock, so that is the end of our time. And hopefully we'll see you all later this semester at another webinar. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.